Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 4, Chapter 6, The 14 Points. President Wilson reached at the armistice the zenith of his power and fame. Since the United States had entered the war in its 32nd month, he had proclaimed more vehemently and upon occasion more powerfully than anyone else the righteousness of the Allied cause. Coming into the struggle fresh and cool, he had seemed to pronounce the conclusions of an impartial judge upon the terrible and frantic disputation. High above the swaying conflict, speaking in tones of majesty and simplicity, deeply instructed in all the arts of popular appeal, clad with power unmeasured and certainly unexhausted, he had appeared to the tortured and toiling combatants like a messenger from another planet sent to the rescue of freedom and justice here below. His words had carried comfort to every Allied people, and had been most helpful in silencing subversive peace propaganda in all its forms. From time to time during the war, the various Allies had declared their war aims. In the bleak January of 1918, both Great Britain and the United States had sought to restate their case in the most reasonable terms. In particular, on January 8, President Wilson had delivered a speech to Congress in which he had mentioned 14 points which should, in his opinion, guide American aspiration. These 14 points, admirably, if vaguely, phrased, consisted in the main of broad principles which could be applied in varying degrees according to the fortunes of war. They included, however, two perfectly definite conditions: the reconstruction of an independent Poland and the retrocession to France of Alsace-Lorraine. The adhesion by the United States to these profoundly important war objectives, involving, as it did, a fight to a finish with Germany, was very satisfactory to the Allies. None of them was concerned to examine the whole speech meticulously or felt committed except in general sympathy. In the meanwhile, the President's declaration played an important part in holding the Western democracies firmly and unitedly to the prosecution of the war, and also encouraged defeatist and subversive movements among the enemy populations. When on October 1 Ludendorff made his panic demand that the German government should immediately ask for an armistice, it was on the basis of these 14 points that Prince Max of Baden addressed himself to President Wilson. Wilson seized the opportunity of keeping the negotiations in his own hands in their first and all-important phase. He exploited the advantages of his position energetically both against the enemy and against the Allies, so as to engross to himself the whole task and its responsibility. He refused to transmit the appeals of the despairing enemy to the Allies until he was himself satisfied of their sincerity. He dealt with the suppliant Germans in the sternest manner. He used the weapon of delay with masterly skill. No armistice was possible, he declared, without absolutely satisfactory safeguards and guarantees of the maintenance of the present military supremacy of the armies of the United States and of its allies. The terms of the armistice must be settled by the Allied commanders. There could be no question of discussing peace until Germany had deprived herself of all power of resuming the war. The Germans were to deliver themselves naked and defenseless to the discretion and judgment of their conquerors. The month occupied by these parleyings had been one incessant gigantic battle on the whole front. The armies of the United States had lost over 100,000 men killed and wounded, and the French, British, and Italians about 380,000. Their advance had been continuous. German resistance had crumpled under the double pressure of the terrors of war and the hopes of peace. At the end, they had fallen prostrate at the presidential footstool. Wilson's conduct of these negotiations had been so strong and skillful that France and Britain, though at first startled by his self-assertion, were content to leave them in his hands. Even the most rigorous against the enemy could find no fault with his swordplay. He had thus been, in the closing stages of the war, the spokesman for all purposes, not only of the United States, but of the Allies. He had enunciated the highest principles. He had driven the hardest of bargains. It was now important to see exactly what this bargain was. When it became evident that the Central Powers were actually in dissolution and were stretching desperate hands towards the 14 points, these propositions suddenly acquired intense practical significance. It became imperative towards the end of October to make sure what the 14 points meant and would be understood to mean by friend and foe. Had the Germans, instead of asking for an armistice, sought a peace by negotiation and meanwhile fought on, the interpretation placed upon the 14 points by them and by each of the Allies might have been reduced to an exact and concrete form. But their collapse was so rapid that they could only sue for an armistice, and in the mere process of the correspondence they became utterly prostrate and finally submitted to conditions which left them henceforward helpless. This development, which far transcended the highest expectation of the Allies, left the victors sole judges of the interpretation which should be placed upon the 14 points, while the vanquished naturally construed them in their most hopeful and generous sense. Through the foresight of Colonel House, a commentary on the 14 points was prepared by the American representative in Paris and approved by the President. This has now been published by Colonel House. It was the brief form which he spoke on all occasions and certainly an accommodating document. Point 3, for instance, prescribed the removal so far as possible of all economic barriers and the establishment of an equality of trade conditions among all the nations. The American commentary prudently explained that this was not intended to prevent tariffs or special railroad rates or post restrictions, so long as they were equally maintained against all. Upon point 4, adequate guarantees given and taken that national armaments will be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety, it was explained that domestic safety clearly implied not only internal policing, but the protection of territory against invasion. Point 5 prescribed a free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims, based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. On this it was made clear that the German colonies would not be returned to Germany, but that whatever power managed them must act as trustee for the natives, and be subject to the supervision of the League of Nations. Point 6, the evacuation of all Russian territory and an unhampered and unembarrassed opportunity for the independent determination of her own political development and national policy. However, it was explained that Russian territory did not mean all the territory belonging to the former Russian Empire, and so on. A meeting was held at the Quai d'Orsay in the afternoon of October 29 between the representatives of France, Great Britain, Italy, and the United States. The principals were Monsieur Clemenceau, Mr. Lloyd George, Mr. Balfour, Baron Sonnino, and Colonel House. The question was how the Allies should reply to President Wilson's note. Mr. Lloyd George said there were two closely connected questions. First, there were the actual terms of an armistice. With this was closely related the question of terms of peace. If the notes which had passed between President Wilson and Germany were closely studied, it would be found that an armistice was proposed on the assumption that the peace would be based on the terms in President Wilson's speeches. The Germans had actually demanded an armistice on these conditions. Consequently, unless something definite was said to the contrary, the Allies would be committed to President Wilson's peace terms. Hence, the first thing to consider was whether these terms were acceptable. He asked Colonel House directly whether the German government were counting on peace being concluded on the basis of President Wilson's 14 points and his other speeches. Colonel House said this was undoubtedly so. Mr. Lloyd George said that unless the Allies made their attitude clear, they would in accepting the armistice be bound to these terms. Monsieur Clemenceau asked whether the British government had ever been consulted about President Wilson's terms. France had not been. If he had never been consulted, he did not see how he could be committed. He asked if the British government considered themselves committed. Mr. Lloyd George replied that they were not committed yet, but if he accepted an armistice without saying anything to the contrary, he would undoubtedly regard the British government as committed to President Wilson's terms. Mr. Balfour confirmed this. Then, said Clemenceau, I want to hear the 14 points. The first point was read. Open covenants of peace, openly arrived at, after which there shall be no private international understandings of any kind, but diplomacy shall proceed always frankly and in public view. Colonel House then read an extract from a later speech made by President Wilson, pointing out that this would not prohibit secret conversations on confidential and delicate matters, provided that the final results were made public. Mr. Balfour said this really amounted to a prohibition of secret treaties rather than secret conversations. The second point was then read. Absolute freedom of navigation upon the seas, outside territorial waters, alike in peace and in war, except as the seas may be closed in whole or in part by international action for the enforcement of international covenants. This point about what is called the freedom of the seas naturally aroused British concern. It sounded well-intentioned, but what did it mean? Did it mean that the right of blockade in time of war was abolished? We were emerging from a struggle in which blockade had played an important part in preserving the liberties of Europe and the rights of the United States. The British Navy had just crushed the submarine. British ships had just carried the greater part of the American army to Europe. We had saved ourselves from invasion and maintained our population unstarved by sea power. It certainly seemed hard to be told, in the moment of common victory by the friend we had aided, that this great weapon of defense was to be blunted, if not broken. It did not follow that the conditions which would prevail in the future would not require and also render possible a review of the whole question of belligerent rights at sea. But now that the enemy's front was being battered down by French and British armies after horrible cost in life and blood, now that Britain, under the shield of the Royal Navy, was coming safely out of the greatest convulsion of mankind, was hardly the moment when we should be asked, at a few days, almost a few hours' notice, to subscribe to a formula in a matter of life and death, which might mean everything or nothing. Mr. Lloyd George said he could not accept this clause under any condition. If it had been in operation at the present time, we should have lost the power of imposing a blockade. Germany had broken down almost as much from the effects of the blockade as from that of the military operations. He would like to see the League of Nations thoroughly established and proved before any discussion on Clause 2 took place. Even after the establishment of the League of Nations, he would only be prepared to begin discussing it. He was not prepared to discuss this question with Germany. It was impossible to make an armistice if doing so committed us to these conditions. Clemenceau and Sonnino agreed with Lloyd George. Colonel House then said that the discussions were leading to this, that all the negotiations up to this point with Germany and Austria would have to be cleaned off the slate. The President would have no alternative but to tell the enemy that his conditions were not accepted by his allies. The question would then arise whether America would not have to take up these questions direct with Germany and Austria. Monsieur Clemenceau asked if Colonel House meant to imply there would be a separate peace between the United States and the enemy. Colonel House said it might lead to this. It would depend upon whether America could or could not agree to the conditions put up by France, Great Britain, and Italy. Now this was assuming a great responsibility for the United States. The armies were still in full battle. Even in this month of extreme American effort, nearly 4 British, French, and Italian soldiers were falling every day to 1 American. The stake of the United States in the European scene was incomparably small. Yet here was a direct threat that if Great Britain, France, and Italy did not swallow the 14 points whole, whatever they might be, or be claimed to be, the United States would withdraw from the line, make a separate peace with Germany and Austria, leave the scene in perfect confusion, and condemn the world to another year of war. It is a measure of Lloyd George's quality, when acting for his country, that he did not quail before this unwarrantable pressure. The Prime Minister replied that it was impossible for the British government to agree to point 2. If the United States were to make a separate peace, we should deeply regret it, but nevertheless should be prepared to go on fighting. Clemenceau here interjected, yes. We could never give up the one power which had enabled the American troops to be brought to Europe. This was a thing we were prepared to fight for and could not give up. Great Britain was not really a military nation. Its main defense was its fleet. To give up the right of using its fleet was a thing no one in England would consent to. Moreover, our sea power had never been exercised harshly. Apart from the question of freedom of the seas, there was no word in President Wilson's speech about reparation for the wanton destruction of property in Belgium and France, and the sinking of ships. Otherwise, he had no objection to the President's 14 points. He suggested that a reply should be sent to the President in the sense that the 14 points must include reparation, that we believed reparation was included in the President's speeches, but that we wished to be perfectly clear about it and that we could not accept the interpretation which we understood Germany put upon the point about the freedom of the seas. Colonel House agreed that the first step was for the Allied governments to get together and make their exceptions to President Wilson's terms. He said later, after other points had been mentioned, that the President's conditions were couched in very broad terms. In the case of Alsace-Lorraine, for example, he did not say specifically that it would go back to France, but he intended it positively. Monsieur Clemenceau said the Germans certainly did not place that interpretation on it. Colonel House continued that the President had said so much, that is, made this clear on other occasions. He had insisted on Germany accepting all his speeches, and from these you could establish almost any point that anyone wished against Germany. Reparation for Belgium and France was certainly implied in clauses 7 and 8, where it was stated that these invaded countries must be evacuated and restored. The same principle applied to illegal sinkings at sea and to the sinking of neutrals. It was then agreed that the reservations of the Allies should be formulated. Nearly a week passed in tension. President Wilson armed Colonel House with an ultimatum which his representative decided to hold in reserve. On October 30, "I feel it my duty to authorize you to say that I cannot consent to take part in negotiations of a peace which does not include the freedom of the seas, because we are pledged to fight not only Prussian militarism, but militarism everywhere. Neither could I participate in a settlement which does not include the League of Nations, because such a peace would result within a period of years in there being no guarantee except universal armaments, which would be disastrous. I hope I shall not be obliged to make this position public." Footnote: in Colonel House's Papers, Volume 4, page 173. End of footnote. Meanwhile, a British draft of reservations was prepared. The Allied governments have given careful consideration to the correspondence which has passed between the President of the United States and the German government. Subject to the qualifications which follow, they declare their willingness to make peace with the government of Germany on the terms of peace laid down in the President's address to Congress of January 8, 1918, and the principles of statements enunciated in subsequent addresses. They must point out, however, that Clause 2, relating to what is usually described as the freedom of the seas, is open to various interpretations, some of which they could not accept. They must therefore reserve for themselves complete freedom of this subject when they enter the peace conference. Further, in the conditions of peace laid down in his address to Congress of January 8, 1918, the President declared that the invaded territories must be restored as well as evacuated and freed. The Allied governments feel that no doubt should be allowed to exist as to what this provision implies. They understand that compensation would be made by Germany for all damage done to the civilian population of the Allies and their property by the forces of Germany, by land, by sea, and from the air. The Italians had other reservations, but it was pointed out that the present negotiation only applied to Germany and did not govern the treatment of Austria-Hungary. Monsieur Clemenceau accepted the British draft, and this became the crucial document. A third meeting was held on November 3 in Colonel House's residence, when House read a message from President Wilson in conciliatory amplification of the formula "freedom of the seas." The President says that he freely and sympathetically recognizes the necessities for the British and their position with regard to the seas both at home and throughout the Empire. Freedom of the seas, he realizes, is a question upon which there should be the freest discussion and the most liberal exchange of views. The President is not sure, however, that the Allies have definitely accepted the principle of the freedom of the seas and that they are reserving only the limitation and free discussion of the subject. The President insists that terms 1, 2, 3, and 14 are essential American terms in the program, and he cannot recede from them. The question of the freedom of the seas need not be discussed with the German government, provided we have agreed amongst ourselves beforehand. Blockade is one of the questions which has been altered by developments in this war, and the law governing it will certainly have to be altered. There is no danger, however, that it will be abolished. Mr. Lloyd George said that the formula adopted by the Allies simply provided for free discussion on point 2 and did not challenge the position of the United States, who were perfectly free to go into the conference and urge their own point of view. Colonel House asked if Mr. Lloyd George could not accept the principle of the freedom of the seas. The Prime Minister replied that he could not. It had come to be associated with the idea of the abandonment of the blockade. He did not want to bind the American government in their discussion, he only wanted to have a free hand for the British government. On Colonel House again asking that the principle should be accepted, Mr. Lloyd George repeated his refusal. Were he to accept, he said, it would only mean that in a week's time a new Prime Minister would be here who would say that he also could not accept the principle. The English people would not look at it. On this point the nation was absolutely solid. Consequently, it was no use for him to say that he could accept when he knew he would not be speaking for the British nation. And again, according to Colonel House, whether at this meeting or at some other is not clear, Mr. Lloyd George said, Great Britain would spend her last guinea to keep her navy superior to that of the United States or any other power, and that no cabinet official could continue in the government in England who took a different position. Footnote. In Colonel House's papers, Volume 4, page 190. End of footnote. Colonel House then modified his position. All that he wanted was the principle that the question could be discussed. No one could object to that. Mr. Lloyd George replied at once, We are quite willing to discuss the freedom of the seas in the light of the new conditions which have arisen in the course of the present war. According to House, the actual conversation was, I wish you would write something I could send to the President, said House. We will like something of this kind, returned Lloyd George. We are quite willing to discuss the freedom of the seas and its application. He confirmed this by letter to Colonel House the same afternoon. House contented himself with this and has rather naively informed us that he reported a diplomatic victory to the President. Footnote in Colonel House's papers, Volume 4, page 188. End of footnote. These matters being adjusted, President Wilson on November 5 forwarded to the Germans the Allied memorandum accepting with reservations the 14 points as the basis of peace, and informed them that armistice terms could be received from Marshal Foch. The Germans had therefore a right to claim that they surrendered and disarmed themselves on President Wilson's 14 points and other speeches, except in so far as these were modified by the formal reservations of the Allies. They were not, however, accorded, nor were they in a position to request any share in the interpretation. This left a latitude to the victors certainly wide enough for misunderstanding and reproach in after years. The sharp interchanges which had taken place within the councils of the Allies, the vague character of many of the 14 points, and the President's speeches, which were to be read with them, to say nothing of the commentary, made it especially desirable to frame without delay a more precise instrument. But nothing was possible for some weeks. The slaughter had to stop. The drawing up of the armistice terms for land and sea, the vast surrender by Germany of her whole remaining powers of self-defense, the internal convulsions in Germany and in other defeated countries, and the celebrations of victory by the Allies filled the compass of human nature. When these overwhelming events and emotions had passed, one fact dominated the scene. It was above all things important to make peace soon. Monsieur Clemenceau, as usual, had clear-cut plans. On November 29, the French ambassador in Washington laid these in the writing before Mr. Lansing. The arrival of President Wilson in Paris in the middle of December will enable the four great powers to agree among themselves upon the conditions of the peace preliminaries to be imposed severally on the enemy without any discussions with him. The examination will first apply to Germany and Bulgaria. After reaching an agreement as to the peace preliminaries, the representatives of the great powers will have to come to an agreement on the principles of the representation of the several belligerent, neutral, and enemy states at the Peace Congress. The great victorious powers alone will attend all its sessions, the small powers being called only to sessions designated for their special affairs. As for the neutrals and states of formation, they may be called when their own interests are at stake. It seems that the labors of the Congress would be divided into two main series: the settlement of the war properly so called, and the organization of the Society of Nations. The examination of the second question no doubt calls for the settlement of the first. Furthermore, the settlement of the concrete questions should not be confounded with the enforcement of the stipulations of general public law. Besides, that distinction is made necessary by the fact that the enemy has no right to discuss the terms that will be imposed upon him by the victors, and that the neutrals will only be called in exceptional cases to attend the sessions where the belligerents will fix the peace terms, while all the peoples, whether belligerents, neutrals, or enemies, will be called to discuss and take part in the principle of the Society of Nations. The procedure of the Congress will also be determined at the preliminary meetings in the second half of December. The Congress finally could place itself, as has sometimes been done in the past, under the invocation of some of the great principles leading to justice, morals, and liberty, which would be proclaimed at its very opening and even before fixing the procedure, concerning which an unofficial agreement only would have been reached. Right of self-determination of the peoples, right of the minorities, suspension of all previous special agreements arrived at by some of the Allies only, with a view to the fullest freedom of the examination by the Congress, declaration that the metropolitan and colonial territory held by the Allies on August 1, 1914 shall not be touched, solemn repudiation of all the violations of international law and humane principles, and disqualification of enemy delegates who have signed violated instruments or are personally guilty of violations of the law of nations or of the crimes against humanity. There is no doubt that the French plan was at once logical, practical, and speedy. It placed the settlement of all main questions and all procedure definitely in the hands of the four great victorious powers who had made the chief exertions in the war. It drew a line between the past and the future. Above all, by the suspension of all previous special agreements arrived at by some of the Allies only, it swept away the whole network of secret treaties contracted in the stress of the war. It brought together the four authorities who alone could settle everything, and secured for them an absolutely free hand. The mature reflections of Colonel House have led him to believe that a preliminary peace should have been negotiated with Germany at the earliest moment. There would have been no difficulty in grafting on the foundation proposed by the French a preliminary peace. This was a device which had often been found helpful in the past. In a preliminary peace only the main essentials are settled between the belligerents, and they then meet together no longer at war to argue at leisure about details and their application. Nothing in the French procedure would have prevented President Wilson from striving, had such been his inclination, for the most lenient terms towards the conquered enemy, or for any disposition of the captured territories which he thought would in the long run be best. Grave conflicts of opinion were inevitable in any case, but they would have arisen in their natural order, and each decision would have made the treatment of secondary problems easier. And agreement between the Big Four, as they afterwards came to be called, was the indispensable prelude to a smooth and speedy peace. The French plan, however, did not at all commend itself to Mr. Wilson. It thrust on one side all the pictures of the peace conference which his ambition and imagination had painted. He did not wish to come to speedy terms with the European allies. He did not wish to meet their leading men around a table. He saw himself for a prolonged period at the summit of the world, chastening the Allies, chastising the Germans, and generally giving laws to mankind. He believed himself capable of appealing to peoples and parliaments over the heads of their own governments, and he had, as we have seen, already hinted a willingness to try. No doubt the French proposal was injudiciously framed. In parts it wore an air almost of cynicism. It seemed to treat high ideals as if they were a mere garnish to agreements on sound policy. The President understood that the overstrained European allies would be above all things anxious for swift settlement, and that delaying procedure would increase his bargaining power. So no answer was returned either by him or by Mr. Lansing to the French note of November 29, and no notice whatever was taken of the French proposal to sweep away the secret treaties. All old-world affairs therefore hung in suspense, and instead of leaders meeting together in goodwill and good faith to make a lasting settlement, the governing forces in each country drifted into an intensive development of their own points of view. The French soon began to reconcile themselves to this delay. If President Wilson was coming to Europe not only to punish the Germans but to discipline them, it perhaps was not regrettable that their armies were getting a firm grip on the Rhine and that the peace conference, whenever it should assemble, would be confronted with accomplished facts. Great Britain was still in the throes of the election, the results of which were not yet known. The Imperial War Cabinet sat almost daily and surveyed the whole future field of the peace. The only inter-allied discussion which took place in this interval was the meeting in London on December 2 and 3 between Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Orlando, House being absent through illness. This meeting, apart from various matters arising out of the armistice, decided only that an inter-allied commission should be set up to report on the amount the enemy countries could pay for reparations and indemnities, that the Kaiser and his accomplices should be brought to trial before an international court, and that before preliminaries of peace should be signed, an inter-allied conference should be held in Paris or Versailles, and the date thereof be settled after the arrival of President Wilson. Here, when time is vital and strength in all its forms is ebbing from the victors, we have a ready acceptance of delay. No doubt all these leading men were too easily persuaded that the world would remain at their feet indefinitely and that they could settle its future fortunes at leisure. Most of all did this illusion dwell with President Wilson. He now wished to preside himself over the peace conference. When House tactfully explained that only a Frenchman could preside over a conference held in Paris, he made it clear that he would sit as a delegate. His best friends in the United States advised him strongly not to descend into the arena. To visit Europe to discuss the main issues in private with the European statesmen was permissible and even desirable. But to quit the lofty isolation of his presidential chair for the rough and tumble of a prolonged peace conference was to sacrifice solid advantages. This American advice was at first strongly reinforced by the wishes of the three European prime ministers. They were disturbed at the idea of the head of a state, a personage of sovereign rank, sitting with them nominally on equal terms, but with inalienable superiority of status. They were alarmed by much that they had heard of Wilson's autocratic temper and airs. But the desires of the president overrode his own advisers, and the Allied chiefs gradually realized that perhaps the president's mistake would conduce to their advantage. If he chose to step down from his pedestal, why were they the losers? House assured them that he was affable in personal relations. So the president had his way. In these discussions and in the immense press of events, November and December soon slipped away, and it was not until the middle of January that the representatives of the 27 states, which had either fought the war or ultimately joined the winning side, assembled in Paris. The most cumbrous procedure had been adopted, but the one feature which would have redeemed it had somehow or other been omitted. All depended upon a serious discussion at the outset between Great Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States, at which the main principles could be settled. But this discussion never took place. The 2 months that followed the armistice had produced no progress of any kind towards the systematic discussion of the peace settlement. By the beginning of January, the world was restive. Everyone asked what had happened to the peace. The representatives of all the smaller states were already congregated in Paris, where they found assembled all the journalists of the world. The second stage, or general meeting of all the powers, overtook and overwhelmed the first. Further delay could not be tolerated, and the conference sprang into being before the fundamental questions had ever been surveyed in common by those who alone had the power to decide.